They're authors. They're working on book design. Do you think we can include them in this movement for the design of the book and web design? That's what I hope. It's very difficult because the traditions are very different, because the culture is different. It's very difficult to quantify. It's a completely different culture of action, so it won't be simple. This is what I hope, that there will be a convergence. But it's also a question of the market as well, if I'm honest. If there is a market for this, if, for example, the publishers do turn to the world of web applications in a more proactive manner, then for them it is a market. If the market's there, then it'll happen. So I think that's an aspect of it. And to some extent, what's perhaps a little bit more complicated is the other direction, is to have an influence from publishers on the way in which websites are developed. Because at this time it's very chaotic. It's not very well done. Often it's not well done. The ergonomics of a lot of sites is absolutely appalling. Sorry to say so, but it's the case. And there is this tradition of publishers, aesthetics, etc., that this is a lot more complex, because publishers, I'm not going to say they don't care, but they don't care, but maybe a little bit. So there is an element of that.
Maybe I'll chime in with one comment, which is, I think that in a way it's not quite so simple as the book publishing or print publishing here, traditional publishing, and web publishing over here, websites, because in fact most of the 20 years of the web publishers, website developers have been making some of the same mistakes of a fixed form mentality of print guys. Really what's new here is mobility, and what Micah Bowers talked about early this morning was the need for a new paradigm of visual design and that is oriented around mobility. In fact, most of that in the mobile world has been done with native apps, not with websites. Responsive design is a relatively new thing. And there's a heck of a lot of websites that, like PDFs, don't work well on my phone, right? I'm sure you all see that, because they're fixed format websites. So the good news is it's not like, oh, we book guys have to move into this new web world and submit to all these learnings of the web guys. It's, to me, rather that both traditional publishers and web developers need to move forward in this world of mobility, of responsive adaptive design. And in some ways, the book guys, having been in ePUB land, which is reflowable, maybe have a little edge in certain ways, as well as the edge in typography and in visual stuff. But it's really about going past the art director mentality of the page maker, page paste up mentality. And I think all the designers from both web and print side need to go together work to invent this new paradigm. It won't be easy, but it gives me hope that it's emerging into the future, not a tug of war between two paradigms.
The two communities are quite different, and they both have a lot to gain. But unfortunately, they don't particularly necessarily work well together. And over the years, we've seen that how that could be improved. To give you an example of this, is a functionality that is for ebooks, and this is magazines, and we're not far. I think some of you are involved in this. In magazines, we had to wait for Adobe and National Geographic to work together in a CSS working group for browsers to be able, if we were to make an effort for those navigators, these browsers to be able to accept the text flow around images, for example, which is the base. It's the very fundamental, creating regions, flows between regions in documents, which everybody does in books and magazines. So if those of you in the room are not really pushing for this in terms of the browser developers, the browsers, and the core of browsers that integrated into all the ePUB reading systems, you won't have the functionalities that you want within your readers. the only way, or in the other way, for us, people from the side of the web, is to ask you, people from publishing, to move towards the web and to go towards this convergence that will mean that an ebook can be on a website without having to have code everywhere to open it, etc. So please do continue to continue doing this lobbying. It's the only way we'll get there. If you can't do that, because you don't have that technical layer, you've got suppliers, application suppliers, Adobe, Microsoft, etc., who you can request that or insist on having this. And sooner or later, it'll come to our table, and we will also do it. Any other questions?
Yes, hi. I guess my question's for Yvonne. It's too confusing. Wouldn't it be quite a bit simpler if your PWP didn't need to be detached from an internet connection? And why did you make that decision that it needed to be?
As I said, I am an expat, meaning that I don't live in France, but I'm in France very often. Meaning when I come here, I cannot be online with my phone because it costs me arms and legs. So what I'm saying is, it's nice to think that I am always online. The reality is not yet that. I am not always online. I cannot be always online. I cannot be expected to be online. And that is probably even more true if I go out of Europe towards the south. So the fact that in some cases the reader is offline is just the reality. We cannot ignore it.
And
excuse me. It would indeed be way simpler if that aspect was not in the picture. I fully agree. It's just that this is a luxury that I believe we cannot allow.
Yeah. And you don't believe that 5-10 years in the future, the problem of connectivity is going to be minimized, not eliminated? You don't think so?
Just to come back to the example I was saying, several years ago, the aforementioned Neelie Kroes has already promised that roaming charges will disappear in Europe by, I think it was 15. Today it's 16, the roaming charges are still there. I would love to be optimistic.
Well, because the converse is that correct me if I'm wrong, you're imposing a lot of heavier technical requirements on the device that's going to render this thing if it's going to be able to be read offline.
It's correct. Now, I agree with that.
So if you're dealing with economic accessibility issues, it's really a trade-off.
Yeah, I agree, but again, I don't believe that within the foreseeable future this is a setup I can live with. It's true it's true in the US, it's true in Canada, and it may be true here as well in the European Union. So maybe we will get the free roaming, to keep to this example. I don't think that would be the case in India necessarily with all the people there, in Africa, even in South America. That's the way it is.
And it's important to keep in mind as well that the range to which this feature is critical depends on what domain you're in, right? If I'm reading a leisure book, who cares if I can't get at chapter 7 of Shades of Grey for a couple of hours, right? It's not, the end of the world. But remember, we're not talking about trade books only here. We're talking about any kind of document which may be used in a mission-critical situation. The pilot starting up a plane or military or archival purposes, you know, and stuff like that. And there it's not a question of what the roaming charge is. The thing is, you have to have an entity, an artifact that is totally independent of its milieu and will still work because it has some mission critical purpose.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons, obviously, people use PDF, right?
Yeah.
Even in highly connected environments. There's another issue, which is privacy, or maybe I should say privacy, since I'm in Europe. But maybe a few of you have heard of this thing called the Panama Papers. And I wanted to say earlier that, you know, if they'd only used ePUB, that we could have analyzed it much faster, which is probably true. But that aside, the fact is, these kind of concerns are heightening the need to kind of, as some people say, re-decentralize the web. And part of that is you can have content that isn't online all the time. And so this blurring of online and offline states, I think, is also about, in part, enabling a level of privacy that's not possible when everything has to be online for everything to work at all. So I think whether it would be simpler to not deal with that case or not, it's just a fact that just as both packaged and unpackaged is important, the other dimension of online offline is also going to stay valid.
Well, so I'm old enough to remember the one laptop per child initiative, and that $100, full function computing devices were going to be made available to people in economically disadvantaged places.
And they are. Absolutely they are. They're just called smartphones. Yeah, go ahead, please. That's all right.
Well, I mean, so I don't want to argue forever or take up a lot of time, but I mean, if you're talking about mission critical documents available to pilots, that's a different paradigm from making educational materials available to people who don't have access to devices that can have all the capabilities that you would need to render all this stuff. That's all I'm suggesting. Anyway, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sorry. Right next to you.
Behind you.
Okay.
Now it works.
One thing I would add to that is that now at the library we have a huge problem with archiving all the ebooks.
Sure.
And there was a discussion years ago already, is a publication a static thing or a dynamic thing? And if it's website-alike, where things change overnight, it will be very hard to reference in a later point in time to what were something on the web years ago. So if you have some kind of versioning, and that was basically my question I would ask, what is your idea about versioning the portable web publications? Because if you want to reference and things change over time, there are no editions anymore there where you can say, okay, in that edition it was on page this or that. These things, well, they change dynamically over time.
In some sense, that question is almost independent of the PWP. This is a general question on, with different version of a website which changes because somebody has added something. So I don't really have an answer at this moment. We have started about a month ago a separate task force within the interest group on archiving, on what are the use cases, what are the requirements from an archiving point of view that a PWP has to fulfill. So I don't have the answer. We are aware of the issue. One thing that we did discuss already is that when you make a copy of a PWP, you essentially get a new canonical locator, as I said, but what we also said that the metadata which is there should possibly have a provenance information built in, a kind of, at the minimum, some sort of a breadcrumb that takes you back via locators to earlier versions, something like that. Again, these are all the things that we know is a problem out there. We have to solve it, but we don't have a solution.
And the we can include all of you, right? I mean,
right.
Both through participating in IDPF, through participating, hopefully, in W3C, if you can. We need to make that. We need to make the right thing happen in this whole vector. And for example, I happen to believe Ivan is wrong in saying that that it's okay to work on addressing and punt on identification. In fact, it's pretty obvious that if we're targeting ePUB and its future evolving into PWP for all kinds of content, all kinds of documents, things like DOI and ISBN that are only really designed for commercial stuff obviously don't work. If I'm just making my presentation here, I don't think you got an ISBN for your slides. So I think that we're going to have to wrestle with at least identification, if not versioning, along this route. Maybe not in day one, but it's something we're going to need to wrestle. So if you care about it, get involved and help us figure out, the big us, figure out what we need to do.
Did you mention the archival task force?
I just said yes.
Sorry? You mentioned
I just said.
Okay.
I just wanted to point out another obvious thing, that we need to remember that PWP is not an alternative to ePUB. The whole point is we don't want two separate formats. We want one format. So yes, an always online PWP would be useful, but then we still need these things called ePUBs that are these packaged, offline, etc. And what we're really trying to get at is not two different things. We're talking about one format that's both things. And that's why it originally was ePUB plus web.
Right.
It wasn't web or ePUB.
And also this was mentioned by Ivan to illustrate your point, Bill. The idea in PWP is also that the publisher can choose whether to use one or both of these. So if I only want to publish online, that's fine. If I only want to publish portable artifacts, that's fine too. If I want to do both, go ahead. But it's not like you have... Yeah.
The way I keep my head from hurting about this is I think of PWP and the paper that's been published by the Digital Publishing Interest Group at W3C that was originally co-authored by these guys. So it was really an IDPF and W3C joint product originally. And the working group is really a joint effort in the sense that its co-chairs come from the IDPF side. I think of PWP as a platonic ideal of where we want to get to. It's this ideal of this beautiful future world. We're going to asymptotically approach that, starting from today's ePUB 3.1. Maybe a lot of the stuff that we're calling PWP now will end up being called ePUB 4, who knows? But that doesn't mean that we may never achieve that platonic ideal. I think part of human perfectibility is that you never get there, right? But that's a stake in the ground of this ultimate result, not a commitment that in 3 years we're going to achieve X precisely, much less how we're going to get there. That's at least the way I think about it. A funny thing is that Yvonne mentioned the 2015 presentation of that paper, but that was at an event called Books in Browsers, which happened to be held at the Internet Archive, which is the closest thing to anyone who's struggling with that intractable problem of archiving websites. And that was received to great acclaim at that conference. And I think pretty much Peter Brantley, who ran the conference, said, "Great, our work is done here, guys. Go make it so." And then that was the last conference of that series.
No, there is a new one.
Okay, well, yeah.
So I have a question. As we often talked about within specifications efforts, implementers and reference implementations are an important component of this. And I'm interested in terms of PWP, that this was, of course, the implementers in this case would be browser makers. And I'm just curious if where the interest lie in terms of the browser makers. I mean, is Mozilla, do we have browser makers actively engaged? Do we have our... He's laughing. But I'm just interested to know, like, as the conversations have gone on, is there any traction at all? And if so, where? Would just be interesting to hear an update on how those conversations are going.
At the moment, it's very scarce. It's very scattered. So it's not even, the problem with the browser makers that I'm not sure what it means. When I talk to one person who works for the browser makers, whether he or she represents that browser maker's official standpoint or not, I don't have the faintest idea. The truth is that, for example, the guy who edited the service workers and who, as I said, said, yeah, this is exactly the use case for us. This is, he used this term, the offline first approach that is interesting, happens to work at Google with Chrome. Now, what exactly is within Chrome, maybe somebody else knows, I don't. And that's the problem in this case. So we have had very sporadic connections, and I acknowledge that they have been sporadic, and if we really think seriously that this has to move on from the current, interest group discussions to something more tangible, then one of the probably most difficult steps that we will have to do is to more formally engage with the web browsers. I realize that. Now, the other part of it is that what I believe will happen, that in the first phase, you would have the, if you like, the Readium kind implementations. So not in the core of the web browser, but on top of the web browsers. And the question is rather, will there be a big enough market for that? Whether it will be in a Readium 2 or whether it is built in the browser, regardless of that, is there a big market for that? If there is a market, then the browser vendors will come in. And that's, I agree, it's still a question mark.
Markus, do you want to add something?
Well, yeah, so Micah, you said the implementers obviously are the browser makers. And while that's true, I think there's another thing that's important to point out, that nobody is trying to erase the marketplace for dedicated ebook reading systems, right? We don't know, but I would expect that there will still be a lot of users who will prefer a dedicated reading system, whatever features it provides in terms of ergonomics and use patterns to read their stuff as well, right? The only thing we're changing here is that the user has a choice between using a browser with some thin JavaScript or a dedicated hardware device. So implementers just as well are all our current reading system providers.
And I see this as the same way, but I think we can reason about this by looking at EPUB, forgetting about PWP for a moment, and just looking at EPUB as the logical next generation portable document format. Every browser now builds in PDF support one way or another. All four major browsers. They are either built into the operating system and pre-linked to the browser. In the case of iOS and OS 10, they are just built into the operating system and browser. In the case of Android and Windows, and in the case of Chrome, built-in PDF viewer. So PDF is just simply a piece of the web that's natively supported in browsers. That wasn't done because the browser guys love PDF and said, "Hey, let's make PDF first class." It was done because the market demanded it. But that didn't erase the need for other PDF readers. And it's not the case necessarily that most PDFs are being consumed in the browser. It's just one convenient thing that the browser happens to have it. Since EPUB is going to be so much, EPUB and its future evolution towards PWP is going to be so much lighter weight for a browser to implement. In fact, Mozilla couldn't even make their own PDF solution, pdf.js. They couldn't make that work reliably in Firefox OS. I'm not claiming that's why Firefox OS didn't fly, but it was certainly annoying that their own PDF solution didn't work on their own OS because it was just too heavy. But EPUB in a browser is a piece of cake by comparison to PDF. So I see that this is just a domino falling. The more, if people start making millions and millions of EPUBs as alternatives to PDF because it's mobile ready and accessible, independent of ebooks, it's a given that it'll be supported in browsers, but it won't erase the market for independent reading systems. That's just what's going to happen. Our job is to accelerate that happening and get out of the chicken and egg problem of people not making EPUBs because nothing's there to read it. But I don't think the way to get out of that chicken and egg problem is to arm twist the browsers before there's demand. I think the way to get out of that problem is things like Bluefire Reader and its successors and competitors right here, right now, solve that problem and therefore get us out of chicken and egg land. So keep at it.
Actually, one thing I realized when Markus answered is that I can very well see a dedicated ebook readers, Bluefire version 10, to use both the traditional ebooks and online access to essentially access PWP on the web. And the examples I gave for educational books shows that the borderline is very fuzzy there. So the dedicated reader will win because it may have a better user interface than the browsers do. It acts as a specialized browser. So there's no problem with that.
I just wanted to mention that the browsers are actually giving us, I think, a lot of the tools we need to make a PWP reader, service workers being the most obvious example. I have, sort of working examples that sort of solve the offline problem with a very simple few lines of code, essentially. And I think the browser vendors seem very interested in moving in that direction generally through, the principle of the Extensible Web Manifesto, Project Houdini and CSS, where we may be able to roll our own very complicated layout and rendering schemes. So I think there's some hope even without browsers, providing dedicated support for PWP built in.
But that's partly because of the engagement, and I want to give, Dave Kramer from Hachette credit, because Hachette joined W3C, because you got involved, you are causing that influence. And as Daniel Glasman said in his comment/question some minutes ago, in order to make this happen, there needs to be a lot tighter communication, a lot more participation, and the browser guys have to know that publishing exists and wants to be on the web and isn't satisfied just making PDFs that are inaccessible and don't work on small screens, but wants to jump in this world, and they need to be part of making it happen. That's starting, but we need more than Hachette and Pearson and a couple others. We need a broader participation. So that's just a small pitch, not for my organization necessarily, but that we need to bring these communities closer together. This event is part of that, and the work in the Digital Publishing Interest Group is part of that. And we're looking to figure out how to take that even further.
So I'd like to add one thing that is important and not very visible. The browsers are the applications that are the most visible and the most used in the whole world by anyone, okay? Billions of browsers are active every day. So compared to other software, they are immensely observed and maintained for the front web, not for the rest. The rest is insignificant compared to the front web as of today, unfortunately. No, for the browser vendors. For the browser vendors. The browser vendors consider that the front web is the only thing that matters.
So the fact that Facebook's app has instantiates a web view, and that actually quite a plurality, if not a majority in many countries of the web content is going through the Facebook native app, not the browser app, that's insignificant? I don't think so.
They use, no, okay. You misunderstood me. Facebook is an application of the front web.
Well, but its use of the web is behind the scenes.
No, again, it's not my personal opinion. That's the browser vendor's opinion. I'm just repeating what they think.
But in that case, iBooks is too, in the same way.
Not really.
It's taking private data and rendering it through a browser.
It's a dedicated rendering engine. But we have to think about one thing. When we design a framework, okay, to handle special content on the web, a JavaScript library, anything that we put above the rendering engine, it's a two-sided sword. On the one hand, you want to tell the browser vendors that you have a new technology and you want them to embed new stuff natively. But on the other hand, you have a framework that works pretty well and they have absolutely no incentive to do it.
Yeah.
So the only way is to keep pushing, saying, yeah, we have a framework, but it doesn't work well, and we have a weight in the market, and we want you to implement things. So that addresses your question, I think. Yeah. It's the only way to do that. Keep pushing.
But it's not unique to publishing, right? I mean, jQuery is a JavaScript library many of you may have heard of that in a sense, implemented a bunch of HTML5 stuff before browsers were HTML5. And as browsers do more and more of that stuff natively, in a way, less and less of it actually gets used. And one of the incentives for browsers to do it is they score higher in performance benchmarks. They were shamed into it, but they were also pushed into it for market pressure. And I think we just need, Readium is just a giant polyfill in a certain way, viewed in a certain way, and we need to make it thinner and thinner as the native browser stack gets better and better for what publishers need.
jQuery was meant to fill the holes of the browser vendors, and that was bad marketing for them. Because jQuery was exposing all the bugs and all the lacks of the rendering engines. If you do the same, then you have some weight.
Good point.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Now I propose that we have a break.